Allens Investigate, airing live on the United Public Radio Network, 105.3 FM in New Orleans.
I hope that's better. I think we just lost our mic there. Anyway, this week we're welcoming back Ralph Ellis, writer, historian, polymath, and independent researcher of biblical and Egyptian history for over 40 years. On today's show, Ralph will be discussing the New Testament and sharing with us his compelling insights and discoveries and the new light that it throws on the biblical story. Welcome, Ralph.
Good to be back with you, Shona, Gary.
Nice to see you again.
How are you? Oh, we've lost him again.
Oh,
and you're back.
No, I'm still here.
How are you?
Very well, thank you. Yes, lots
good.
of interest, not only from your show, but quite a few other shows I've been doing. So, yes, interest is growing, you might say.
Brilliant.
I hope you got your Easter egg, did you?
It's a long time since I've done Easter.
Oh dear.
Well, that's really good to hear, Ralph, that you're getting some interest, because it means that people are actually now starting to search and question things, which is a really good thing.
Yeah.
Yep, that's the whole goal of the books and these talks and so on. I can't tell people the absolute truth because, well, who knows that?
Exactly,
all I can give is pointers to where people should look. And these are good, solid pointers that the story is not quite as you've been taught.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, you've been doing it for over 40 years and you've actually gone to visit these places. You lived also out, I think it's in the Middle East as well.
Yes,
I mean,
in the Near East, in Anatolia, yes.
Yeah, so I mean, you've had access to go and visit these places for yourself, haven't you?
Yes, yeah, I was in Anatolia for 6 years. I lived in Israel for 6 months, and I visited all of these places. Just come back from that region just October last year, so I did another tour as a guide. I was the guide on a couple of tours across Anatolia and Egypt, so that was good fun.
Wow. Wow.
So would you like, Ralph, would you like to refresh people's memories to part 1, which was about the Old Testament? Just a brief outline.
Yes. So the main thesis on all of my books is that for some peculiar reason, none of these personalities can be, or events and so on, can be found in the historical record. And we went through a load of events and characters from the Old Testament, you know, all of the established, you know, Jacob and Joseph and Moses and all of the events of the Old Testament. Although we didn't do David and Solomon, but the same happens there. They are missing from the historical record. And so we went about trying to find these characters in the historical record and found them in the history of Egypt. And the story was exactly the same as the Old Testament, the only difference being that these characters were slightly more famous and powerful than the Old Testament makes out. So we ended up with a few pharaohs and very important characters within Egyptian history. And basically, that's what I've done with the New Testament. So we have the same problem with the New Testament in that all of these characters are missing from the historical record. You know, Jesus, Saul or Saint Paul, who's probably more influential than Jesus. Remember, it was St. Paul, it was Saul who wrote most of the New Testament. And they are both missing from the historical record. So how can that be? I mean, it was a very literate era. You have only got to read the works of Josephus Flavius to know this was a highly literate people and a highly literate era where they could have recorded their entire history. And yet they're missing. And they're missing despite Jesus being called a king. on 36 occasions he was the king of the Jews, and they say, oh, well, yes, he's called a king, but he wasn't really. He was just a carpenter. Yeah, okay, we'll come on to that in a minute. But yes, do remember he was called a king on many occasions, and he was called the Christ and the Messiah. Now, people have a sort of inflated view of those titles, but Christ just means king. It's the anointed king of the Jews. Same as Messiah, it means the anointed one. And King David.
Sorry, Ralph. I was going to say, because I believe from a Jewish perspective, they don't see Jesus as a Messiah, i.e. he didn't fulfill the messianic prophecy. So I believe they call it Meshiach, don't they? And a king or a priest, I believe, could be anointed with oil. So really the term Messiah could be applied to a king or a priest, for example.
Yes, they were often priest kings. And remember, King David was the Messiah. So was Cyrus the Great. He was the Messiah because he let the Jews go from Babylon. So you can be a normal secular king and you can still be the Messiah. And yes, you're right. It means you are anointed. But remember that Jesus was anointed by Mary Magdalene at the house of Simon. Now, that ceremony is the ceremony to make a king or a priest king of the Jews. And it's the same ceremony that Queen Elizabeth II went through when she was anointed onto the throne of Great Britain. She was actually anointed with oil by the high priest, who happened to be the Archbishop of Canterbury. And I do wonder if the new King Charles is going to be anointed in the same fashion. We don't know exactly what that ceremony is going to be like. But the high priest does it, which indicates immediately that Mary Magdalene was the high priest, because she anointed him with spikenard oil. So therefore, she was very, very important. She was the primary disciple. She was the high priest of the Nazarene church. So that puts a different spin on things for starters. And we've only just, we're only 3 minutes in.
Well, it does rather, because I think really when you look at sort of patriarchal religions and the Muslim religions, it's all very male dominated, isn't it? And they tend to have forgotten the female somewhat.
Yes, yes, they've done that all the way through. And they've lost these people from history. And you have to ask yourself, how have they managed to do that? And why? If it was on purpose, why have they managed to do that? Well, what I want to do initially in the first sort of half hour or 40 minutes or so is to prove to viewers that this was Roman propaganda, that it was done on purpose. This was all to do with a revolt against Rome. And what Rome didn't want you to know is that you could revolt against Rome. They wanted to cover it up, and they did. Very expertly, they covered it up. And so this king guy, they managed to cover it up, because how can you lose a king from history? I mean, they're well-known people. We know of pretty much, I think, all of the kings of the Near East from this sort of era. So how can you lose a king from history? Well, we know that has happened, because if you, I say that these people are actually the kings of Edessa. And we'll go through the Edessa place later. But you can prove to yourself that it's been deleted from history, because you can do a search through the works of Josephus Flavius, and you can type in Edessa, and it will say nothing found. And you can type in King Abgarus, who was the king of Edessa, or King Manu, who was the, and it will say nothing found. Okay. So we know that Josephus Flavius was deliberately deleting these people from history.
Interesting. So he was basically the arm of the propaganda arm of Rome, then, you would say.
Yes, because he was working for Rome. He was employed by Emperor Vespasian. So a quick review of Josephus Flavius. because this is how I found the biblical Jesus. And I did this back in 1997, a long time ago, in my Jesus Last of the Pharaohs. But that was just 1 or 2 chapters. And then I had to revisit this story back in 2005 or 8, I think, when I wrote my King Jesus, which fleshed out that story a bit more. And then I discovered Edessa, because I started to write another book, which was known as Queen Helena. And halfway through the research for this book, I suddenly found Edessa, which I'd never heard of before. It's been deleted so expertly from history, and started researching Edessa, and suddenly found all of these connections, which we're going to go through in the rest of this talk. So yes, and I found that through the identity of Saul, or St. Paul.
It's very strange. It's very strange that when I was a young boy growing up, I lived in Odessa Road in Forest Gate. So
yes, that would be Odessa, I think, not Edessa.
Odessa. Odessa.
Yeah, Odessa is on the Black Sea. Edessa is Sanliurfa in Anatolia. It's just north of Aleppo.
Oh, right, okay.
And it was named after the capital city of Greece, which was Edessa. So it's a Greek city that, a Greek village almost, but became a city in the 1st century. And that's the city I think is connected with the gospel story. So, well, perhaps we should find out what this story was all about first. Because it was a much more important story than I think people understand, and we can get an idea of what it was about from the story of the parable, should I say, of the vineyard owner. So we have these parables which are deliberately made so you can read them on 2 levels. And what does it, even on the surface, this one makes no sense, but people have never understood the underlying message of this particular parable. So this comes from Matthew 21:33. I think there are other copies throughout the other Gospels. And very quickly, it says, there was a lord, an absentee landlord, who planted a vineyard and let it out to a tenant, and then he went to a faraway country. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants so he would receive his rent for his lands. But the tenant took his servants and beat one and killed another and stoned another. So when the Lord comes to the vineyard, what will he do to these tenants? He will miserably destroy these wicked men and let out his vineyard to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. So why is Jesus promoting the rights of absentee landlords? To kill their tenants if they don't pay their rent on time.
That's an interesting one.
What happened to the man of the people, Jesus? He seems to have gone somewhere.
Oh, Lord.
Not sure where he went to on that parable. And so they have to sort of interpret that parable in strange ways and say, the tenant is the church and things like this. And it makes no sense whatsoever.
No.
But it does make sense. All you have to do is change the landlord to the Edessan king and the tenant to the Romans. Now we understand what this story was all about. So we can reread this again, and it says, there was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea. The Edessans owned Judea at that time. The queen of Edessa, Queen Helena, which we will talk about later, she was the queen of the Jews. She had the largest palace and the largest tomb in Jerusalem. That changes things somewhat. So the queen of Edessa was the queen of Jerusalem at this time. Okay, so let's go back to the parable. There was an Edessan king who had lands in Judea and let it out to the Romans and went to a far country. He went back to Edessa. And when the harvest drew near, he sent his servants to the Romans that he might receive his rent for his lands. But the Romans took his servants, and they beat one, they killed another, and stoned another. So when the Edessan king of these lands comes, what will he do to these Romans? He will miserably destroy these wicked Romans and let out his lands to another tenant who will pay their rent on time. Okay, now we can understand what this means. It was a justification for a war with Rome, because there was a war with Rome at about this time. It's called the Jewish Revolt. And so what we have is a justification for that Jewish revolt. The Romans were occupying these lands as tenants on my land, as it were, and they weren't paying any rent. Worse than that, they were demanding rent from the Edessans, because this was a tax dispute. It was a well-known tax dispute from the works of Josephus. And so that's the basis for the gospel story. We have this tax dispute between the Edessans and the Romans over not only their lands up in northern Syria, but also in Judea, which they considered to be theirs as well, because the queen of Edessa was the queen of the Jews. They'd converted to Judaism. They were Nazarene Jews. And remember that Jesus was a Nazarene Jew, of course. He was of the same religion. We get this from the Talmud. I mean, this all comes from original historical sources. All of my work comes from original texts. So I don't read other researchers. I go back to the original text and I give you what it says in the Talmud, in the Old Testament, New Testament, and the works of Josephus and Moses of Corine and various other, people who have reported this history.
It's certainly best to look at your own research, Ralph. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Be sure in your own findings. Yeah.
Yeah, because I find that people have not seen the truth, either because they missed it or maybe they were influenced not to see it. It's very easy to avert your eyes to something if it conflicts with your belief system. And so they've not seen the obvious context. And the second one we can go through very quickly, which again just sets the scene that this is something to do with the Edessan royal family, which nobody's ever heard of. I imagine your listeners and viewers have not heard of Edessa. But we have a very famous event with the beheading of John the Baptist. And you might think that that is just a New Testament gospel story, but it's not. We get this story from Josephus Flavius as well, which does indicate that Josephus Flavius knew about these events, gospel events, although he doesn't mention them very often. And if he does, he mentions them in code, as we will see in a minute. So this was about Herod Antipas and his marriage, because he had divorced Pharsalus, who was the daughter of King Aretas of Petra, the rose-red city, and sent her back home again and married Herodias, who was the wife of Herod Philip. And of course, John the Baptist said, you can't do that. That's an illegal marriage, because Herodias was, what was she? She was the ex-wife of Herod Philip. So she was very closely related to Herod Antipas. And so John the Baptist said, this is an illegal marriage. She was the half-niece, I think, of Herod Antipas. Anyway, so because of this, Herod got his head chopped off. Sorry, did I say Herod? John the Baptist. Let's get the names right. John the Baptist got his head chopped off. And that's that famous little extract from the Gospels, Mark 16:17, I think. No, 6:17, I think that one is. For Herod had bound John in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother's Philip's wife, for he had married her. So it was an illegal marriage that John the Baptist complained about. Anyway, we get a continuation of this from Josephus Flavius, who's the historian of this era, Jewish historian. And he says about King Aretas of Petra, he says King Aretas had an argument with Herod Antipas. So they raised armies and prepared for war. And when they had joined battle, all of Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives from the lands of Herod Philip, who joined with Aretas's army. So Aretas sent up his army, and he was joined by some other band of soldiers to defeat Herod Antipas. And they did. They defeated him. Okay. Well, that doesn't really tell us very much, because Josephus is being very economical with the truth, as he often is when it conflicts with his master's commands, his masters being the Romans. Yeah, and he calls these extra troops, he calls the treachery of some fugitives. What's all that about? Josephus knows everybody in first century Judea. So, what's he covering up here? Well, luckily, we get another copy of this story by Moses of Corinne, who was a Syriac historian from Armenia, basically. And he wrote the history of the Armenians. Now, he has an advantage because he was separated from Rome. Armenia and the East was separated from Rome via the Council of Nicaea, the Council of Chalcedon, and the Iron Curtain of Islam, which descended over the region in the 7th century. 7th century. And cut off Eastern Christianity from Western Christianity. So they could do whatever they liked in Rome, but they had no control over what the Eastern Christians were writing about their people and their events and their view of the gospel stories. And so Moses of Corinne is completely independent of Rome. And he gives us the same story, except it's slightly different. So he says, King Akbar, having returned to his city of Edessa, allied himself with King Aretas of Petra and gave him some auxiliary troops to make war upon Herod Antipas. Being sharply attacked, Herod's troops were defeated thanks to the help of the brave Armenians, the Edessans. As if by divine providence, vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. Now that's interesting, because he's filling in the blanks that Josephus Flavius has left in the story. And he says that these fugitives who helped King Aretas was the Edessan army. And that's interesting on several points, because it tells us that Josephus Flavius has deleted the Edessans deliberately, because he obviously knew who these people were, but he doesn't ever write about them unless in code. So he's deleted Edessa from his history. Secondly, it tells us that the Edessans were involved in the gospel story. Because why did this battle take place? Well, we know why Aretas was upset. He was upset because his daughter had been spurned and sent back to Petra. So we know why he was sending an army to punish the Judeans. But why were the Edessans down there? The only other thing that happened at this time was the beheading of John the Baptist. And as Moses of Corinne says, it's as by divine providence that vengeance was taken for the death of John the Baptist. So the Edessans were down there to avenge the death of John the Baptist, which rather indicates that John the Baptist was linked to the Edessan royal family. He was a priest or a prince of Edessa. And you would not get that if you're just reading the gospel story.
No,
or if you're just reading Josephus. So already we've overturned a lot of the classical interpretation of the Gospels. The Gospels were something to do with Edessa and something to do with the Jewish revolt. And we can get another account of this, because we get, would you believe that Saul, St. Paul, was an ambassador of Edessa. And we get this from Acts 11:28. And it says there, and one of them stood up named Agabus, and signified by the Spirit that would be a great famine throughout the world, which came to pass in the days of Claudius Caesar. This is thought to have been about AD 49, AD 50, something like that. Then the disciples, it's talking about the disciples of Jesus, every man according to his ability determined to send relief, famine relief, to the brethren which dwelt in Judea, which they did. And they sent it to the elders of Jerusalem by the hands of Barnabas and Saul. Okay, so there was a famine, and famine relief money was sent, and it was something to do with Agabus. Right, well, that's never really been interpreted. I think Professor Robert Eisenman was the only one to reinterpret this, and he didn't fully interpret the end result of this, which I was disappointed in. But according to Eisenman, Agabus has to be King Agabus of Edessa. They've changed his name to mean the locust, and we'll go through this in a minute, why the Edessans were called locusts. But we know this was King Agabus of Edessa, not simply because the name is similar, but this giving of famine relief money was a very famous event. Josephus Flavius reports it, and it was given by the royal family of Adiabene and Queen Helena. We've already talked about Queen Helena. She was the Queen of Judea in the AD 50s, 60s. And she was, as I've said, the Queen of Edessa. But of course, Josephus Flavius says she was the Queen of Adiabene. Now, I, for a long time, have said that Adiabene is fictitious. It's a pseudonym made by Josephus Flavius to cover up what he's talking about.
Okay.
And we get that, of course, from Moses of Corinne, the Syriac historian, who says that Queen Helena of Adiabene was married to King Agabus of Edessa. So at the very least, these two principalities, Adiabene and Edessa, were linked through marriage. I think that Adiabene doesn't exist, because Adiabene is way over in Mosul, down in modern Iraq. And there's no way in the world the Romans, because the Romans later say that they conquered Adiabene, there's no way in the world that the Romans would go that far into Parthia and defeat the Parthians without coming across the Parthian army, which was a very, very strong army. So I think Adiabene is a pseudonym, and we're talking about Edessa here. So it was the royal family of Edessa who was giving this famine relief money. That's what it says in Acts 11:28. Agabus is King Agabus. But the interesting thing here is that this famine relief money was taken to Jerusalem by Saul and Barnabas. So St. Paul, Saul, was an ambassador of Edessa. Now that changes the story somewhat.
Yeah.
So already we're beginning to see this alternative story.
Yeah.
And where should we go on to from here? We might go on to the chronological chasm, because the Gospels say that this story occurred in the AD 20s, AD 30, and Jesus was crucified in AD 30 about that time. But there are many aspects within the Gospel story which indicate a later date. We have Jesus who says that Jerusalem will be surrounded by a wall and a trench, and not one stone will be left upon the other. That is a description of the siege of Jerusalem in AD 68. That comes directly from the works of Josephus. Jesus laments the death of Zacharias Baruch, and it's long been known that this is most probably Zacharias Barachias, because the method of the death is exactly the same. He was killed between the altar and the temple on the Temple Mount. And Jesus laments his death. The only trouble being that he didn't die until AD 68, which is a problem.
It is a problem.
Yeah, and then Jesus mocks Zizit ben Hakasith. That comes from the Talmud. Let me just look up the reference. People won't know this because it's not an obvious reference in the Gospels. It comes from Matthew 22:5, where Jesus is mocking the aristocracy for their indulgences, I should say. He says they make broad their phylacteries and enlarge their fringes, and they love the uppermost rooms at the feasts and the chief seats or cushions in the synagogues. Matthew 22:5. That won't mean much to people unless you read the Talmud, because the Talmud gives the same quote. And the Talmud tells us what it means. And it's wordplay. The Talmud is just full of wordplay continually. So the fringes are a zizit and the cushions are a kesef. So you can get Ben Zizith HaKesef, the name of the person they are mocking.
Sounds like you got a bit of a lisp.
Yes, there's definitely a lisp. So they are mocking this guy for his ostentatiousness. He loved these long fringes. You know, the Jews wear fringes on the side of their trousers and so on.
Yes.
And big phylacteries. That's the square box that they put on their heads. And they're big cushions, because they used to sit on cushions, not chairs, in the synagogues. So they were mocking this guy, and Jesus mocks this guy in the same fashion with the same wordplay. The trouble is, this guy was a leader of the Jewish revolt in the AD 66, AD 68. So again and again and again, we see pointers in the gospel story that this was a much later story. It was something to do with the Jewish revolt. Because remember, Jesus was jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. It says so in the Gospel of Matthew. Which revolution was this? Okay, well, now if it's a later date, then it is most probably the Jewish revolt. Which started in AD 66 and it went on to AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed and the temple was destroyed and all of the Jews were sent into exile. Josephus says some 2 million. It's probably an exaggeration. Most things in the works of Josephus are an exaggeration, but he says 2 million people were sent into exile.
And I also, sorry, Ralph, I was going to say, I also think that there are very specific numbers given in the Bible as well for a specific reason.
Yes, I generally think, yes, there are some numbers with, yes, specific meanings. I talk about the number 40, for instance, with specific meaning, but yes, we can go into that later. But generally, if you're looking at numbers of deaths and soldiers and exiles and whatever in the works of Josephus, you normally have to divide by 5 or 10 to get the true figure.
Yeah.
That's the rate of exaggeration he gives. But undoubtedly it happened. We have a history of this. We know that the Jews were exiled from Jerusalem, which became a Roman city, and they changed its name and everything after AD 70. So that was the basis upon which I knew that something was wrong with the current interpretation of the Gospels. Now, the next thing was, who was Saul? St. Paul. Why is he missing from the historical record? He's the most famous guy in the last 2,000 years. Never mind Jesus, it was Saul who wrote the New Testament.
Yeah.
Christianity is the church of Saul, not the church of Jesus. Remember, Jesus was a Nazarene Jew who was not going to let one jot or tittle of the Mosaic law be undone. It was Saul who promoted faith instead of the law. And it was Saul who won. They ended up with, we can go through this a bit later, but there was a contention between these two churches. Saul had set up his own church as a youngster, and he had gone off across the Mediterranean, and he had preached this new church of, faith in Jesus, I suppose you might call it. And that church became rather more successful because he became the apostle to the Gentiles. So he had a much bigger audience. You know, Jesus and James were only evangelizing to other Jews to turn them into Nazarene. So they had a very limited audience. But Saul could preach to anybody, and he did. So he was evangelizing as the apostle to the Gentiles, he called himself. And he became more and more powerful. And so we had two churches that were at each other's throats, as is quite obvious if you read Acts of the Apostles. And it was the church of Saul that won this particular dispute. And it was the church of Saul that became Christianity, while the church of Jesus and James faded into obscurity. So Christians are actually venerating the church of the opposition of Jesus, not the actual church of Jesus. So Saul is a very important person in Christian history, and yet he's missing from the historical record. So how can that be so? Can we find this guy in the historical record?
I have a feeling that you have.
Yes, I have indeed. It's coming, isn't it? So, yeah, the conflation of Saul and Josephus. Well, I did this conflation back in 1997 again with my Jesus Last of the Pharaohs. But as I say, that was just 2 chapters in a book about the Old Testament, effectively. And had a lot of opposition. But my further research in 2008 has proven it most definitely so. And I get less and less opposition now to this because people are finding it very, very difficult to argue against. So we have this Saul character, and we have another character who is very similar. And let's go through some of the similarities. They were both Jews. They were both raised in Jerusalem. They both had Roman citizenship, which was a little bit unusual in that era to be a Roman as a Jew. They were educated as a Pharisee. They both became rabbis. They both disparaged long hair, which is actually important because the Edessans and the Nazarene always wore long hair. That was the difference between Saul and the Edessans and the Nazarene. Remember, Jesus was a Nazarene because the Nazarene were descended from the Nazarites, who always grew their hair long. I think that was, I forget what that was. But anyway, Saul disparages it in 1 Corinthians 11:14 by saying that long hair is shameful on a man. So he was definitely against long hair.
There you go, darling.
Yeah.
I knew there was hope, Ralph.
That's why we've all got such short hair nowadays.
That's right.
It's all gone, I'm afraid.
You washed and it went.
Yeah, that's right. So they both had a flash of inspiration and changed sides. Remember, Saul had a flash of inspiration and changed to the Church of Jesus. This other guy had a flash of inspiration and changed to the side of the Romans. They both traveled widely in Europe. They were both stoned and attacked by their opposition. And they were both on the same prison ship. Well, they both went to prison, first of all. So Saul had 7 years, we think, in prison. And here's another thing about Saul, why we're at it. He was sent to prison for preaching things that were against Judaism. But while he was in prison, I mean, everyone, they make out that Saul was a pauper, the same as they do with Jesus. They say he was a tent maker. But when he was in jail, he was visited by all of the governors of Judea and by the king and queen, as it were, of Judea. Agrippa II and his sister wife, Berenike. They all came to see Saul while he was in prison. Sorry, but the king and the queen don't come to see tent makers when they're in prison.
Not normally.
Not normally. So we know that this.
Unless they want a tent made anyway.
Yeah, and the governors were asking for bribes You don't go to a prison to ask bribes from a tent maker. It's just not how it's done. This tent maker, as a bit of an aside, they were not. He was not a tent maker. He was a Sukkot maker, and a Sukkot is a tent from the Festival of Tents, or the Festival of Tabernacles, which is a big Jewish holiday. And they make tents, and they all go and live in a tent for 2 days or whatever over the festival period, which is a representation of the tabernacle. The thing is that the Edessan Queen Helena of Edessa at Diabeni, had the largest Sukkot in Judea. And so who was making that Sukkot? It was obviously Saul, because he was a tent maker. But there we go. That's an aside. It just shows you how important these characters were. So they were in prison. This other guy was in prison as well. And then they were both sent on the same prison ship to go to plead their case with Rome, with Emperor Nero. Again, this is an indication of the importance of these people. You don't send tent makers to go and see Nero. You know,
No.
if the governor of Judea had done that and they'd arrived in Rome to see Nero,
So my tent maker.
Nero would have said, "What are these stupid governors doing? Send that governor to me. That governor can be executed, you know. Can't he even keep control in his own province, you know?"
Get rid of all these tent makers out of my
It's this guild of tent makers, you know, they're real troublemakers. So yes, they were on the same prison ship, off to see Nero. And the ship has a name. I love the details sometimes you get out of this. Is why I tend to think that the Gospels were real history. The ship they traveled on was called Castor and Pollux.
Oh, well,
Yeah, which is a good name for a ship.
it certainly is.
And but anyway, they got shipwrecked. So there was a big storm on this ship for 3 days. And again, it's a very good story about the shipwreck, how they had to lighten the load.
3 days. Sorry, Ralph.
Sorry, I missed that.
Sorry, I was just saying it's interesting. It's 3 days, isn't it?
Oh, it's always 3 days. It has to be.
Yeah.
They had to put the lifeboat. Did you know they carried lifeboats in those days? Anyway.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, they carried lifeboats. So they had to put the lifeboat over the back because it was too heavy. So they trailed it behind on a rope. Then they heard breakers in front of them. So they were listening for the roar of the waves breaking. And so they put anchors out the back of the boat to try and stop it being driven onto the land. But they were unsuccessful, and it was driven onto the land, which was Malta, and the ship was wrecked. So both of these people ended up on Malta, and then they were both taken by another ship to go to Naples and then to go to Rome to see Emperor Nero. Etc., etc., etc. Oh, and they both had the same publisher as well. The publisher of Saul was Epaphroditus, and the publisher of this other guy was also Epaphroditus. So there are many similarities, you might say. So who is this other guy? He is Josephus Flavius. Now that's interesting. If Saul is Josephus Flavius, it would actually explain quite a lot.
Yes, it would.
Because one of the difficulties we have with the gospel story is that Saul was going around, Judea, you could say, Galilee and that sort of region, and arresting people and putting them in prison. What does it say? It says, I, Saul, persecuted the way unto death. The way, that needs explaining. The Church of Jesus and James was called the Way.
Right.
Which, that's an aside. Just for we can go into that later. So he says, I persecuted the way unto death, binding and delivering them into prison, both men and women. Okay, how was Saul doing this? Under what authority was a tent maker arresting people and putting them into prison and putting them to death? It's not possible. it doesn't make sense. None of this story makes sense into the standard interpretation. So how can this be possible? Well, if Saul was Josephus Flavius, Josephus Flavius was the army commander in command of Galilee. He was a Judean army commander at that time, in the run-up to the Jewish revolt, so after AD 66. He was a Jewish army commander in command of Galilee. And what he was doing was persecuting a guy called Jesus. Remember the plaintive cry, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Which comes from, what's that? Acts 22:7, I think that comes from. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Says Jesus. Well, Josephus Flavius, when he was in Galilee, was persecuting a guy called Jesus and chasing him around Galilee and arresting him and putting him in prison. It just so happens this guy is called Jesus of Gamala, Gamala Saphias. And Jesus of Gamala Saphias was the leader of 600 rebel fishermen. Who was the leader of rebel fishermen in this era? Yeah, okay. I think that might be something to do with the biblical Jesus. And I might do a quick screen share at that, because we get yes, that. So if I go to, let's find where you are, StreamYard, here we go, settings, and no, I don't want that.
Yeah, don't forget to describe it, Ralph, for our listeners.
Yeah, because we're
indeed, I shall do that, yes.
Angel.
So share a screen, and I want share a window. Let's do that one and share. Okay, now that should be coming up. There we go.
Yay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is just an image of the shipwreck of Saul and Josephus, because they were both on the same ship. This comes from Malta, because the people of Malta understand this history. That the boat was shipwrecked on Malta. This is one of their cathedrals in Malta. And this is just another, oh, that's a bit small. Let me make it bigger. This is not just another ancient lithograph of the shipwreck of Saul and being saved on the land. But there we go. But the image I wanted was this one. You'll find quite a few of these knocking around the cathedrals and churches of Europe. This one's from Germany. I think this is from Leipzig. Not quite sure. If I remember correctly, this is Leipzig. And it's an image of Saul having his flash of inspiration on the road to Damascus. Very famous event, of course, from the Gospels. But have a look at Saul. He's dressed in Roman armor.
Yeah,
interesting.
Now, why would Saul... Now, there's an excuse about this, that somewhere in the epistles, Saul says, put on the armor of God or something. And that's why they say he's dressed in armor. But it's also quite possible that people understood that he was Josephus Flavius, because Josephus Flavius was the Judean army commander in command of Galilee. And then he became a Roman army commander, because he changed sides. He had a flash of inspiration on the road to Jotapata, and he became a Roman. So their histories mix and match very closely.
Yes.
And that was the inspiration to go looking deeper into the origins of the gospel story and Jesus himself. Because again, we have this problem that Jesus is missing from the historical record. How can you lose all of these very important people from real history? You know, especially if this is to do with the Jewish revolt, very famous event within history. Gospel story seems to be indicating that it's something linked to the Jewish revolt. And yet, the main character involved, Jesus the King, remember, he's King Jesus. Christ Jesus means King Jesus. We're missing the king from that historical record. And we've already indicated that he might come from Edessa. But how on earth did we get this king in Edessa? Why was he so important? I think he came from Rome and Egypt, because in the gospel stories, he's known as the Egyptian false prophet.
Right.
Now we know this. I mean, we get the Egyptian false prophet both in Acts of the Apostles and also in the works of Josephus, and it's not entirely explained who this guy is, but it was the Egyptian false prophet who took the 5,000 out into the wilderness. Now, who did that? Oh, yes, that was the Jesus character. It was the Egyptian false prophet who had the meeting on the Mount of Olives that was interrupted by the Roman guard. Now, who did that? Oh, yes, that was Jesus. It's pretty obvious that the Egyptian false prophet was Jesus, because that's what his detractors, of course, would tell him, would call him, because they didn't agree with him. He was the Egyptian false prophet. And remember, Jesus went to Egypt for his education. All of his youth was spent in Egypt, according to the gospel story. And of course, if he was a prince of Edessa, of course he would go to Egypt, because that was the main university in the whole of the Roman Empire was at Alexandria. If you're going to be educated anywhere, you're going to be educated in Alexandria. And that's pretty well, we seem to know that from the history of the Edessans, that their princes went to Egypt as well.
So that fire in Alexandria is quite handy, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it got rid of a lot of, that's probably another reason why it happened. Yes, it got rid of a lot of evidence.
Let's have a fire.
Yeah.
The library would have had all of his, student records.
Yeah. Oh dear.
Over in Alexandria, but they all went up in flames. Yeah,
they did. Yeah, they did.
As you say, it's convenient.
Convenient, yeah.
So we can take this back to Queen Cleopatra, which is where I think Jesus came from. Now that changes the story somewhat. So Cleopatra was with Julius Caesar, of course. They were sort of a couple. They weren't supposed to be married because he had another wife. But anyway, they were an item. But in Ides of March, 44 BC, Julius Caesar is cut down by a number of senators. And Cleopatra was in Rome at the time. And she fled immediately because her life was in danger. She fled back to Egypt. And Cicero said of her, I'm grieved to hear of Tertia's loss of an expected child, but I will be glad of such a loss in the case of Queen Cleopatra, and that expected scion of the breed of Caesar. So Cicero is saying that Cleopatra was pregnant.
Yeah.
And she was going to have an heir to the throne of Rome, which Cicero didn't want. They didn't want a monarchy as such. And so later on in another letter, he is most glad that the problem has gone away. And there's only a couple of reasons why the problem would go away. And that's either the child was stillborn or something of that nature, or it was a girl. Yeah. Because a girl could not become the emperor of Rome. So he'd be very, very happy if it was a girl. Yeah. And then we move on a couple of decades. And now we have Augustus is emperor, and he's trying to sort out his borders around the Roman Empire. And so he has this menagerie of princes, because they did this collection of princes and exiles in Rome and kept them in Rome just in case they'd be useful in the future. So he had the children of Cleopatra over in Rome. Right. So he gave Cleopatra Selene, who was the daughter of Cleopatra by Mark Antony, to Yuba II of Mauritania, North Africa. And North Africa at that time was rather wealthy. And they set up a rather wealthy and productive empire, as it were, subject to Rome, of course, but in North Africa. And so this is the mausoleum. People don't seem to know much about this. So if I do a share screen again.
Okay.
So if I go to this one, this is the tomb of Cleopatra Selene, the daughter of Cleopatra, which is over in Algeria. And it's huge, it's enormous. Nothing has ever been found in it. So it's still a bit of a mystery. There are various passageways inside it, but the tomb has not been found.
Interesting.
So we're not sure if they're there or not. So Augustus was concerned enough that he gave a daughter of Cleopatra to a minor prince called Juba II. And then he went to Parthia over in the east. So Parthia is Persia, same place.
Yeah.
And he wanted to sort out his eastern borders. And so he goes to Phraates IV, who's the king of Parthia, Persia. And he gives him Thea Musa Aurania, who was a concubine, like a prostitute.
Okay.
And you think, well, that's not going to work, because Parthia was the great enemy of Rome. Rome had already lost 3 battles and about 3 legions to the Parthians. They were the mortal enemy of the Romans. And so Augustus goes to Phraates IV and gives him a concubine called Thea Musa Aurania. And you have to think, well, something's wrong there. She could not have been a concubine. And for many reasons, I think this is the lost daughter of Cleopatra.
Right, interesting.
Because, well, we'd already seen one daughter of Cleopatra was given to the king of North Africa. But Phraates IV was so impressed with his new concubine, his new prostitute, that he made her the chief wife and the queen of all Parthia. Shows that she must have been quite important. And that's why, amongst many reasons, I think she was the other daughter of Cleopatra through Julius Caesar.
Yeah, it would lead you to think that, wouldn't it? For sure.
Yeah, she has to be much more important. And the other reason, I suppose, if I do another quick screen share.
Perhaps history has remembered her as a concubine / prostitute, simply to get rid of that importance of the Egyptian line, perhaps.
Yes, I'm sure there's a lot of people didn't want you to know this history. And Josephus especially didn't want you to know much about the Edessans, because they turn into the Edessans later. And so he's deleting these people from history by giving them the wrong appellations and the wrong names sometimes, just to change the history around. Like saying Adiabeni when he's meaning Edessa, when clearly Adiabeni never existed. There is no archaeological evidence for an Adiabeni anywhere in Parthia. So anyway, yes, he calls this lady Thea Musa Aurania, and I say she's linked to Cleopatra. And just check I'm sharing. Yes, I'm sharing. So these are the 2 queens in question.
Oh, okay. So you got lovely pictures there of them.
Yeah, 2 statues. Left is Queen Cleopatra. Okay. The right one is Thea Musa Aurania, the queen of Parthia. Is that a resemblance?
Yeah.
Looks like it to me.
The nose looks very similar, doesn't it?
And the receding sort of chin and the small mouth. It all looks very, very much the same. And these are supposed to be, according to Josephus and my research, mother and daughter. Could they be mother and daughter? I think they could. I think they are very, very alike. And remember, of course, that, the way I find this is I do the research. I come across this historical possible conflation. I then go looking into it deeper. I find this statue, because this statue is not easy. It's in Iraq. It's not very easy to go and find. And lo and behold, she looks just like Cleopatra, which is what I postulated. So I think that is actually quite true, that Theomusa Orania was the daughter of Cleopatra. But she didn't stay as queen for a long time. Well, she got thrown out. Oh. So in 2 BC, she was accused of killing her husband. So Josephus says of this, at first, Phraates IV treated Theomusa as a concubine, but after she had a son named Phraatesses, he declared her his lawful wife and held her in honor. The son, Phraatesses, that's the son of Phraates, considered it dangerous and a tedious thing to have power handed over by his father. So he plotted with the assistance of his mother, Theomusa, to do away with his father. There is also a story that he had sexual relations with his mother, which they often did. But also, Theomusa would need a male to rule alongside, because she could not rule Parthia as a queen. So she needed a consort anyway, whether they were in a sexual relation or not. Phraatesses was detested for both reasons and was embroiled in a civil war before he had gathered much strength and driven from the throne. So what's happened here is that Theomusa Orania and her son, Phraatesses, killed their father, Phraates IV, in about 2 BC. And then in 4 AD, so they became the king and queen of Parthia. We've got coins of them as king and queen of Parthia, ruling Parthia. But then they were kicked out. And where were they kicked out to? Well, Josephus Flavius takes up the story. Remember that these people were Jews, or they became Jews. Josephus Flavius says, when Herod understood, this would be Herod Antipas, or Archelaus. It would be Herod Archelaus, not Herod the Great. When Herod understood that there was a man that was a Jew who had come out of Babylon, Parthia, with 500 horsemen and 100 of his relations, and passed over the Euphrates, now abode in Antioch, Herod sent for this man and promised to give him land tax-free. Okay, so if we conflate all of these different stories, this is a story of this royal family being kicked out of Parthia, going towards the west, going to Herod Archelaus, and to Emperor Augustus, because he would have controlled that region, and asking for land in Syria, basically. And they gave him land tax-free. Now, what Rome wanted, the reason for giving them this land was Rome wanted a buffer state between Rome and Parthia to stop all of the international fraction that was happening between those two empires. And so it suited Rome to have this independent principality who would act as a buffer state between the two. And that's why they gave them this land tax-free. And that land was Edessa and Palmyra. That was what became known as the County of Edessa. It was the Principality of Orania, it was known, and it was also known as the Osrone, you might see it. And that was the Principality of Edessa, which was this independent state between Rome and Parthia. However, having said all that, we now have the nativity story. So what is the Nativity? The Nativity is a story about a royal family. Okay, we've already said that Jesus was a king. He was known as the Christ. He was known as the Messiah, which means the king. They were on a journey for some reason in Syrio-Judea, something to do with taxation, which it is. But they were poor because they didn't have a palace to be in, so they were lodging in a stable. And they were visited by the Magi. And the Magi are the Persian priesthood. Now, why would the Persian Magi want to come to the birth of a lowly Jew in Judea? Makes absolutely no sense. I was just going to share a screen there. Can you enable screen sharing? I'm not sure if you have to do anything your end.
No, we can't do anything our end.
Okay, I'll redo it then. I'll do it again. Sometimes it doesn't come up. I don't know why. So anyway, share screen. So share a window. Here we go. And share.
Hey, here we go.
Oh, there you go. So it did come up. So yeah, that's the image we had previously. So what I was going to give you a little image of was oh, that's a bit small. Let me make that bigger. The three Magi. This is a very typical image of the three Magi.
Yes.
They were the Persian priesthood and kingmakers. Why on earth were the Persian priesthood and kingmakers coming to see a lowly Jew in Judea? Makes no sense.
No.
However, if this was the ex-Parthian royal family who had just been exiled from Parthia and were now living in Syria, it would make every sense, because any son born to this family would have been a potential prince of Parthia, Persia. That's why they came to this particular birth, because this particular prince would have been the most well-connected prince in the whole of the world, because he was descended from Rome, from Egypt, from Greece, through, Cleopatra, and Parthia, and they were Jews. So effectively, this prince would have been the prince of the whole world, which is effectively what they said when they started talking about the star prophecy. The star prophecy was a Judaic prophecy that's recorded by several chroniclers like Josephus, that says that the next emperor of Rome would be a star from the east, a king from the east. Now, who was born under the eastern star? It was a prophecy that said that the next emperor of Rome would be Jesus himself. That's why these people were so important. And we'll come on to why that's true in a minute. But just as a bit of fun, notice their hats. They're wearing the Phrygian cap, which I'm sure has a lot of deeper meaning than it's given. It's supposed to be the cap of freedom, but I go through various possibilities of why this cap was so important. For people that are listening, it's a sort of tight-fitting cap with a sort of hood that folds over at the front. So it sort of flops over at the front in a strange fashion. It's known as the Phrygian cap, and it's very important. And if you go to France, of course, even in the modern world, I mean, you can trace this Phrygian cap all over the empire. But if you go to France, the primary symbol of France is the Marianne. And of course, the Marianne is wearing a Phrygian cap. This is a coin.
Of a coin, yeah.
Yeah, this is a coin of the Republic of Française with the Marianne and a Phrygian cap on her head. And note it's got the two sort of flaps down the back of her head. That is very typically Parthian. You get that a lot on all of the Parthian coins.
Okay.
And this floppy bit on the top of the cap, I get the impression sometimes, and I have no direct evidence for this, that this is the cap of the Nemean lion. If you remember the images of Hercules, he has the the skin of the Nemean lion on his head, which sort of looks like this, with the sort of legs of the lion running down the back of Hercules. Looks exactly the same as this. So it could be something to do with that.
It also actually reminds me of the Smurfs.
It does.
Funny you should say that.
Aha! I must be psychic or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Smurfs are wearing the Phrygian.
Oh,
so
my
yes,
word, yeah.
listeners, we're looking at a picture of the Smurfs here.
With the hats on, yeah.
And the blue Smurfs, they wear a Phrygian cap.
Interesting.
It has a lot more importance to it. And
also, it's quite like the Smurfs also remind me a bit of Ptah as well, the Egyptian god.
Oh, Ptah, yes. I'm not entirely sure the provenance of this cap, but the final picture we've got here is three ladies from France who are dressed as the Marianne, and again they're all wearing the Smurfs hat, the Phrygian cap. So, and they're dressed sort of as virgins, because it's the Marianne. If we go back to the coin, the Marianne is quite obviously Mary Magdalene. So the symbol of France is Mary Magdalene wearing the Phrygian cap.
Very interesting. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
We have a lot of interesting things on this.
Yeah.
So that let me stop sharing that screen. And where does that take us up to? So we've arrived with Jesus in Jesus being a king of Edessa. Now, the thing is, there's a limited amount I can do within this amount of time. We could talk for 4 hours easily. But the thing about this, we could just carry on. This king of Edessa had the same name as Jesus. So if you amalgamate, so the name of Jesus was King. We've said he's a king. King Jesus Emmanuel. Now, that prophecy is a very strange prophecy because it never came true. So perhaps I should just read that one. It's Matthew 1:23, which is the most stupid prophecy ever made. It says, "Behold, a virgin shall be with child and shall bring forth a son, and they will call his name Emmanuel," which means God with us. So the prophecy that said that this guy was going to become the Christ, the Messiah, was that his name would be Emmanuel. But Jesus was never called Emmanuel once within the gospel story. So the prophecy failed at the first hurdle. And so Jesus could not have been the Messiah or the Christ because he was never called Emmanuel. So we have a very strange prophecy, which only makes sense if you understand Edessa, because the Edessan king was called King Esus Manu, the 6th of Edessa. So his name within the works of Josephus is Isates, and it's always translated in the English as Isates, and that's a real problem because that's not what Josephus says. So if you read it in the Greek from Josephus, he gives him a short name, and that short name is Isa or Isus.
Isus, yeah.
From which I think that the name for Jesus was actually derived. So his name was Isus Manu, and of course, Emmanuel, if you divide it up, is E-Manu-El. So it's a very nice confirmation to anyone within a secret society that this is the truth, that this secret society holds the truth, because you can whisper in someone's ear and saying, Manu was the king.
Oh, I think we appear to have a frozen Ralph at the moment.
Frozen Ralph, oh dear. Just at that very, very important point.
Ralph, if you can hear us, you're frozen. Something's happened.
Something's happened to Ralph.
But it's a very interesting story, isn't it? And also talking of the word Isus as well, I remember finding a Gaulish god who coincidentally was also called Isus. And he was actually a carpenter, which is also rather interesting as well.
Never chippy, was he?
Yeah, chippy.
Oh, good grief.
Oh, so
well,
yeah,
you know, that's the thing is Ralph comes up with some amazing stuff, doesn't he? But
yeah.
yeah.
Michelle has just asked a question. She said, curiosity with respect to the connections to the Gospel of Caesar. Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. But it's a shame we've lost Ralph.
Yes, he's been zapped.
Wow.
But
Divine providence.
Well, but there are certainly some really, really interesting questions that would arise from all this. And it also shows, I think, the importance and strong connection with Egypt as well.
Oh,
because,
absolutely.
As we discussed on the previous show with Ralph, we were talking about the Old Testament and the connections with Egypt and Akhenaten. Akhenaten also being the pharaoh that actually tried to bring in monotheism. So the connections are very interesting. And I did actually find something, because I know Ralph was talking about the Gospel of Matthew earlier on, and I found something which was quite interesting as well, because there's a piece in there where Matthew says at 3:17, "And lo, a voice from heaven saying, 'This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased,' is actually extremely similar to on the pyramid text, where the sky goddess Nut, speaking from heaven regarding the deceased who assumes the role of Osiris, remarks, 'This is my son, my firstborn. This is my beloved, with whom I have been satisfied.'" So there are some quite interesting links to Egypt. And I think if you were to look at the precepts of Matt as well.
Ralph. Is Ralph back again?
Ralph is back again. What happened, Ralph?
Back.
Something divine happened there, Ralph.
Divine providence, yes.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well,
He was upset with my talk. There was a big flash of lightning and my internet went out.
Wow.
All that was left was your boots. There was smoke coming out.
So glad you're back, Ralph, anyway.
Yeah, we managed to get back. So how far did I get before I suddenly dropped off? I was talking about
we
Manu.
were talking about the name
Manu,
Isus
wasn't it?
and Manu.
Yes, so
you were listening.
yes, they have the same name. So one is
Kevin has commented himself, Ralph has risen.
Ralph was resurrected. Oh, Lord.
So yeah, one of them was called King Jesus Emmanuel, and the other one was called King Jesus Manu the Sixth of Edessa. So they have the same name, and they have many of the same attributes. So if I do a quick share screen,
okay.
so we should come back to the coin. Now, if I run down a little bit and show you this one, they both wore a crown of thorns. So we have this very well-known story of Jesus being crucified while wearing a purple cloak and a crown of thorns. And again, this is interpreted as being rustic, as they always try to do. But of course, the Edessan monarchy always wore a crown of thorns. So this is a later king of Edessa. This is a King Abgarus from the 2nd century. And he's wearing a crown of thorns. And for listeners, this is not what you would normally expect for a crown of thorns. It's not a crown of brambles. This is a proper Pope's mitre, so a domed crown on the top of his head, and on the crown is a load of spikes. It's a crown of thorns. Not only that, it's a plaited crown of thorns. Remember in the description in the Gospels, it was a plaited crown of thorns. And this, you can see the cross hatching on it.
Yes,
It's plaited. It's a plaited crown of thorns. And this was worn by all of the Edessan monarchs from the very inception of Edessa all the way through to its end, which was in the 3rd century. So we have another very close connection between the Edessans and the Gospel story. So I'll just stop sharing there and come back to you. There we go. And there's many things we could go through here, but I think one of the good proofs of this comes from the Huqoq mosaic. Now, this is a doubly a good proof because this came after I had done all my research and written the book. So the book had already been published by this stage. So I had to go back and add this as an extra in the 2nd, 3rd edition. And they found a mosaic in Huqoq, which is just northwest of Galilee, at another of these synagogue sites that have zodiacs. Have we talked about the zodiacs of Judea?
We talked about the zodiac in the Old Testament.
We touched on Dendra, didn't we?
And also the Dendra temple as well, the zodiac. Because
yes,
that was
did we go through the zodiac at Hamat on the Sea of Galilee?
Yes.
Probably.
Yes, you
yes,
showed
we talked about that. Okay.
Yeah, it might be worth bringing up again, though,
sure.
in case, nobody's actually, if they haven't heard.
Well, I'll do it literally in 2 minutes because we don't need to spend too much time on it. We've got other things to go through. So let's do a quick screen share.
Also, a question came up from Kevin as well. And he said, what do you think the plaited thorns mean? Do you have any idea of that? Or
this has been a conundrum ever since I found this. So nobody knows what these thorns are on the top of this crown. Now, in Parthia, they used to have a number of things on the top. Some of the kings had gazelles. So literally, they have little images of a gazelle all around the top of the crown. So they have a variety of emblems, as it were, symbols on the top of these crowns. And this one looks like a thorn, or maybe not, because it's diamond shape. It's thin, thicker, and then thinner again. I wondered if it was a feather. And I tentatively linked it up with the feathers of the phoenix, because it looks like the Elagabal stone. I don't know if did we talk about the Elagabal stone?
I don't remember us touching on that.
No. Well, perhaps we'll go through that in a minute. But the Elagabal is the sacred stone of the east, of Egypt, of Greece, of Parthia, of Edessa, because the Elagabal stone was in Edessa in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Then it went down to Syria, then it went to Rome. And the Elagabal stone looks like this crown. It's a domed small stone. It was the same stone that Jacob put his head on, the pillow of Jacob. It's the same stone. It's why the primary disciple of Jesus was called Peter. Well, his name was not Peter, he was Simon, but he was given the title Peter, meaning the stone, because he was the keeper of the stone. And this stone was always linked to the phoenix. It's normally embossed with the image of the phoenix on it. And so I was wondering if these were feathers of the phoenix bird. But that's only a guess, because nobody knows what these are.
I was going to say, it reminds me of the Ben stone of Egypt.
Yeah, that is, the Elagabal is the Ben. It's the same stone, all about it. But the Ben went missing, of course, in the Greek era, and it ended up in Greece, and then it went to Parthia, then it went to Syria, then ended up in Rome eventually. And some say it's in Scotland. Some say it is the stone of Scone. upon which Charlie Boy is going to be coronated.
Charlie Boy's going to be sitting on it.
Yeah, I presume they're bringing it back down again from Scotland, are they? I don't know, for the coronation.
I don't know.
I've not heard, but anyway, it's supposed to be the stone upon which the English and Scottish monarchs have been crowned. But of course, that one is not the real stone. That's just a lump of sandstone. The real one is supposed to be a meteorite. It's supposed to be a very different beast indeed.
Interesting.
It's supposed to be a metallic meteorite. And in Arthurian legend, it's called the Holy Grail. So if you're looking for the Holy Grail, well, here it is. It's sitting on the head of this king. He's got an image of the of the Ben on his head.
Yeah, well,
I think anyway. I mean, that's only a guesstimate.
I was going to
because
say,
the odd thing is, when this stone was in Greece and in Parthia, it had the same mesh cross banding on it, exactly the same as this. And we don't know what that mesh was. It's like a net or something that was covering it.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's all quite interesting as well, because, I mean, you could interpret that. I was going on to say scales, so that it could be to do with the fish god, Oannes.
Yes. That's another possibility.
There's a possibility. And also the spikes that are pointing out does kind of remind me of Sol Invictus. So you've got the sun rays coming out of the head.
Yeah, there were some emperors and so on and kings of Greece that used to have spikes of the sun god. So yes, it could be sun rays. That's possible. But the Elagabal stone was linked to the sun because it was supposed to be a piece of the sun that had broken off and fallen to earth as a meteorite.
It's interesting. Them spikes sort of remind you of the one in America, didn't it? The
Statue of Liberty.
Statue of Liberty, which was given by France, wasn't it?
Well, she is wearing the rays of the sun again on her head.
Yes, we're getting somewhere.
Yeah, she is Roma. You can see her on many coins. If you look at the coins of Rome, you can see the Statue of Liberty on the coins of Rome, and she is normally called Roma. She has another name as well. I can't remember, but anyway. Going back to the zodiacs, this is the zodiac on the Sea of Galilee. Yeah. This is a Jewish zodiac in a synagogue on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And so it's incongruous in many ways. This is a Nazarene zodiac. It was owned by Jesus. Josephus Flavius says so. So Jesus.
Oh, it must be right then.
And note it's got Helios in the center.
Yeah.
Which is very heretical for a Jewish synagogue to have Helios stuck in the center. And Helios is holding the earth, a spherical earth, in his gravitational grasp.
Yes.
So, and we can see that on the image there, which shows that they understood the heliocentric model of the solar system. And we can see it's a sphere because if we look at this zoomed in image, you can see that the circle it's light and dark. So it's light on the left side and dark on the right, just as a sphere would be if it was lit from one side. And the lines of latitude and longitude on it are curved, indicating it must be a sphere.
Yeah.
And so this is the level of knowledge they had within the Nazarene Church of Jesus and James.
Is there any possibility that could be a firmament? No.
Well, the firmament was what you mean, the arc? No, it's not an arc. It's actually a full circle.
Oh, full circle. Okay.
Yeah. So it's the full circle of the zodiac with all the standard signs of the zodiac all around.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Which is also heretical. Josephus Flavius was sent here to destroy the images of animals because they were heretical in the first century.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, though, isn't it? Because if you look at the four evangelists, Luke, Mark, John, and Matthew, which were the bull, lion, eagle, and man, that's also the four fixed signs of the zodiac: Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius. Curious.
Oh, yes, there's many allusions within the gospel story to the zodiac and the signs of the zodiac. I mean, Jesus sends someone off to the house of the water bearer,
Yeah.
Well, that's Aquarius for starters. I mean, it's all of these signs of the zodiac live in houses. These are known as houses of each constellation.
Yes.
So yes, we were going to talk about Hukok.
Sorry, I was just going to say also, there's just to add on to that also that the sun passes through the 12 houses, the 12 signs of the zodiac through the cyclical year as well.
And also, this is a processional zodiac, so it also passes through each sign through the whole 360 degrees in 26,000 years. This was known as the Great Year, and each sign of the zodiac was a great month. And each lasting about 2,200 years. And you can see the head of Helios is pointing between Taurus and Pisces. The great month of Taurus and the great month of Pisces. That's why Jesus was born as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men. Because he was born at the conjunction between the two. So yes, it was all sort of astrological. I was going to say something else about that. Can't remember. Oh yes, our current year, we're in 2023, has nothing to do with the birth of Jesus as such. We're in 2023 of the age of Pisces, of the great month of Pisces. So the date was zeroed, the year was zeroed for the start of the age of Pisces, not the birth of Jesus. So it should be, instead of AD, it should be AP, after Pisces. Yes. What's this? Oh, this is Palmyra. Well, this is not to do with anything at all, but I thought I'd just show you this. This is the Temple of Bel in Palmyra, which I think was owned by the Edessan royal family. It was one of the largest temples in the Roman Empire, and perhaps the richest, because the pillars have no capitals, because you can possibly see that just above the gate. You can see there's no capitals on the top. It's because the capitals were actually made of bronze. Which was stupendously expensive in those days, to have bronze capitals on the pillars. And here's another view of the entrance to the Temple of Bel. All of this has been blown up, of course, by ISIS. I was one of the last people to see it before it was all blown up.
Tragic.
Absolutely tragic. Yeah, they should be made to rebuild it. You know, don't send these people into prison, put them in Palmyra and make them rebuild the Temple of Bel.
Yes.
But there we go. This is what we wanted to look at. So this is the image of a zodiac that was discovered 4 years, or at least it was only published five years, I think, after my book was published. And this is the Hukok mosaic. And it's caused a bit of consternation because nobody knows what it is, but I knew exactly what this is, because if you look at my Jesus King of Edessa book, this character here, next to the small calf, is the character that I've got on the front of my book. So I wrote about this character 5 years before this mosaic was even discovered.
Interesting.
This is what I like about, the conclusions to my research, is that it's even become predictive. It's not just that it makes sense, the jigsaw puzzle, all of the pieces fit, but it's also predictive, and it can say what is still there in the ground waiting to be discovered. So I knew exactly what this mosaic was, but the chief archaeologist said it was an image of Alexander the Great visiting the high priest of Jerusalem, because this is in a Jewish synagogue, of course. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute. Alexander the Great was never shown with a mustache and beard. He was always clean shaven. And he would not have worn a Jewish payot, a side lock of hair. Let's zoom in a little bit. You can see he's wearing a side lock of hair.
Yes, I can.
A Jewish curly side lock. Alexander the Great, he was not Alexander the Great Jew. This is This is not Alexander the Great. And I don't know if you can see on his legs as well. I bet it, on his legs, you can see his legs are darker. That's because he's wearing stockings.
All right.
As opposed to the high priest, who's got brighter legs, because he's not. Wearing stockings was a Parthian and an Edessan habit. The Romans and the Greeks did not. So we can tell that this is an Edessan or a Parthian.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I better describe this actually for listeners. So we've got a mosaic here. On the right of the mosaic, we've got an army and 2 war elephants with big shields on their sides. We've got a small calf, very happy looking calf. Then we've got a king. We know he's a king because he's wearing a diadema headband with long hair and ginger beard. So he's the ginger king. A purple cloak.
Prince Harry again.
Yeah, it's like Prince Harry. Well, there is a connection there, isn't there?
Ginger.
He's wearing a purple cloak, which is the symbol of Rome. And he's meeting with the high priest of Jerusalem. He's the guy in white with the grey hair or white hair. And there's a load of priests behind him, and they're all armed. The priests have swords, and you can't see it, but underneath this, there's another register, which they didn't release for a long, long time. But underneath this is another register where this army and its war elephants is all destroyed, and they're all dead. They're all upside down. So this army gets defeated. So again, this can't be Alexander, because Alexander's army was never defeated. It's impossible. This can't be Alexander. And of course, the chief archaeologist sold this story to National Geographic.
All right. Okay.
As an exclusive, including all the pictures as an exclusive. And National Geographic ran it as a story of mosaic of Alexander the Great discovered in Israel. Yeah.
Oh,
you can see that they paid quite a lot of money for that story.
A lot of money.
Eek.
And and what National
they don't need you now.
They wanted a headline. They wanted a splash headline, which was Alexander the Great. What they didn't want was a splash headline saying Bar Kamsa found in Israel.
Oh dear.
Because that makes no sense to most people. So they sold this. This is history for hire, basically, for rent, to the highest bidder, which I was fairly disgusted about, because I mean, they've got a whole team. It's not just Jody Magnus. There's a whole team out there on this excavation, uncovering this synagogue. They would have had 30 people working there, including lots of scholars. In fact, they had 5 scholars and a load of Judaic theologians and whatever, who should understand a little bit about Judaism, one would have thought. And they had never obviously read the Talmud, and they didn't know the history of Bar Kamsa. But of course, I knew about this because I've been writing about this guy in my book, in my Jesus King of Edessa. Anyway, bearing in mind what this mosaic looks like, this is what the Talmud says about Bar Kamsa. And this again is to do with the Jewish revolt. Everything revolves around the Jewish revolt. So Yohanan, this is Yohanan ben Zakkai. He is the high priest of, as it were, Jerusalem after the Jewish revolt. So he's a Roman lackey who is now the leader of the Jews after the Jewish revolt and after the temple has been destroyed. So Yohanan went and said to the Emperor Nero, the Jews are rebelling against you. And Nero said, how can I tell? That's a little in-joke, of course, because the Jews are always rebelling. And Yohanan said to him, send them an offering and see if they will offer it on the altar in the temple of Jerusalem. So Yohanan sent Bar Kamsa with a fine calf as an offering. And while on the way, Bar Kamsa made a blemish on its upper lip. And there is the fine calf that Bar Kamsa is offering to the high priest of Jerusalem on the mosaic. And if you look on his lip, you can see a little cut on his lip.
Sorry, can you do you know what the H means? We've been asked a question. Do you know what the H is on the?
Nobody knows. I've done a long investigation into this. It has a special name which I can't remember, but there are a lot of images in the East, mostly to do with Judaism, but sometimes with Greek characters as well, where they have symbols on their cloaks.
Okay.
And the symbols are all different. And they are not characters of the alphabet, because obviously in Aramaic they didn't have an H. There is no H in Aramaic. And nobody knows what this symbol means. I did a very speculative story linking it up with the Göbekli Tepe, because they have a lot of H's there.
Right, okay.
But that's all very speculative, because nobody knows what the H means, which is funny because these people obviously did. It's so prominent on their cloaks. Everyone must have known what this H meant, but nobody does now.
Obviously got lost in the mist of time. Well, if any of our listeners happen to know,
if they know,
what
please.
the H symbol means.
Well, it looks like an H. It might not be an H, might it?
No, it might be on its side. No, it's...
It looks like an H.
It looks like two pillars with
two
a bit
pillars?
in the middle.
Yeah.
2 pillars, isn't it? With a bridge in the middle, maybe.
We need a whole long discussion about that. I did do a Facebook post about this, and it was quite long and detailed. Anyway, the Talmud goes on, and it says the rabbis were inclined to offer it, the calf, in order to not offend the government, to not offend the Romans. But Rabbi Zechariah Abkulus said to them, people will say that blemished animals are to be offered on the altar. This is why Bar Kamsa blemished it, because now this calf was now unacceptable, because it was a heathen calf. It was given by an emperor of Rome, and now it had a blemish on its lip. There's no way it could be offered on the altar at the temple of Jerusalem. No. What he's doing here is, this is Machiavellian. This is all politics. What he's trying to do is create tension between Judaism and Rome, because the kings of Edessa wanted to start a revolt against Rome. And what better way of doing that than to set Rome against the Jews? And then, of course, my enemy's enemy is my friend. Then the Jews and the Edessans can link up and destroy Rome in the east. You see what he's trying to do here?
Yeah.
Trying to put the cat amongst the pigeons and all the rest of it, stirring up trouble. They then proposed that they would kill Bar Kamsa so that he would not go and inform against them. But Rabbi Zechariah said to them, is one who makes a blemish on a consecrated animal to be put to death? This is typical of the Talmud. There's a rule for everything in the Talmud. There's a rule for kosher on how to deal with snow.
Really?
There is a rule about how you must clean your bedclothes. There's a rule for everything. And this is one of these sort of rules. So Rabbi Yohanan thereupon remarked, through the scrupulousness of Rabbi Zechariah, our house has been destroyed, our temple burnt, and we ourselves have been exiled from our land. This comes from Gittin 55-57. So again, this is to do with the Jewish revolt, because the temple was burnt and they were exiled from their lands because of this mosaic. This is why this image was so important, that it was in a synagogue, because this was the very start of the Jewish revolt. It was this meeting between Bar Kamsa and the high priest with the calf offering that started the Jewish revolt. That was one of the key elements that started it.
Right.
And then you've got to decide, who on earth is Bar Kamsa? Well, Bar Kamsa is obviously the leader of the Jewish revolt. And the leader of the Jewish revolt in this era is given to us by Josephus Flavius. And he says it was the kings and princes of Adiabeni. And Adiabene, as we know, is Edessa, because the queen of Adiabene was the queen of Edessa. That's Queen Helena. So, just 1 minute. So, this royal character must be the king of Edessa. That's why he's wearing a diadema headband. That is why he's wearing a Jewish payot, a curly side lock of hair, because they were Nazarene Jews. The Talmud says that Queen Helena converted to Judaism. There is a whole episode in the works of Josephus and in Acts of the Apostles on the conversion of this royal family to Judaism. And they converted to Nazarene Judaism. So yes, that's why he's wearing a curly side lock of hair. And that's why he's wearing a purple cloak.
Yeah.
Remember, the purple cloak was the emblem of the Emperor of Rome. It shows the intent of this person. This has nothing to do with Judea. He wanted to take over Rome because in AD 68, the throne of Rome was empty because Nero was dead. Nero had been killed by Epaphroditus. And remember that in Epaphroditus was the scribe working for Emperor Nero. And remember that the publisher and scribe working for Josephus Flavius and for Saul was Epaphroditus. Wheels within wheels. So this character here is a very, very early image of Jesus. Because Jesus was the king of Edessa who started the war against Rome. And that's what this guy is doing. So this is King Esus Manu of Edessa, the 6th of Edessa, complete with his ginger hair and his purple cloak. Because remember, Jesus was crucified while wearing a crown of thorns and a purple cloak.
Right.
And of course, the Edessans wore a crown of thorns, and here he is wearing a purple cloak.
Yeah.
And then below this, in the next register below, of course, his army was destroyed because, yes, the revolt against Rome failed. The army was destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed. And all of the Jews were exiled into the Roman Empire. And that was the end of the gospel story. And then, of course, Josephus Flavius relates, because remember, Josephus Flavius had changed sides. He was a Judean army commander, but then he surrendered to Rome at Jotapata. He surrendered to Vespasian. And then he became a Roman army commander. And after the Jewish revolt, Josephus was coming back from Tekoa, which is Herodium, just to the south of Jerusalem, with a detachment of Roman soldiers. And he came across 3 of the leaders of the Jewish revolt being crucified in the Kidron Valley, just outside Jerusalem. And so he went to the governor to have them taken down early. They were taken down early. They were given medical attention. 2 of them died and 1 of them survived. Right. Familiar story? Yeah, of course it is, because that's the crucifixion story. Yeah. That's the Passion of Christ. And it's given to us in the works of Josephus Flavius, but he says that these were the leaders of the Jewish revolt, the leaders of Edessa Adiabene. And the person who took them down from the cross was Josephus Bar Matthias, because that was his proper name. Josephus of Arimatheus.
Sounds familiar.
And Arthurian legend says exactly that Joseph of Arimathea was Josephus Flavius. So now he has another pseudonym. And people don't like it when I give people too many pseudonyms. But remember, these people had many names. Jesus in the Gospels has something like 30 different names and appellations within the Gospels alone. Wow. Judas was called Judas, Thomas, Didymus, Labbaeus, Thaddeus, Addai. So he's got 6 names alone. So it's not too surprising that Josephus Flavius would have had 2 or 3 pseudonyms, especially as he could not admit that this was him. in writing the gospel sort of story, there's no way in the world that anyone would print this if they had known that the gospel writer was Josephus Flavius instead of Saul. Nobody would want Josephus Flavius as being the author of most of their gospels, because Josephus Flavius was such an awful character. He was a traitor. He was a slimy egotist who only worked for one person, and that was himself. So, and of course, you could not admit that this guy was Josephus Flavius because the dates don't match. We've not talked about the chronological chasm. What Rome did with this story is they took this story and they didn't want people to know that revolts against Rome happened and anyone venerating the leader of the Jewish revolt. So they stuck the story back in the AD 20s and AD 30. 40 years difference. And they did that on purpose to separate it from the real history. And so everyone was saying, of course, well, this Saul can't be Josephus because Josephus was only born in AD 37 and therefore he's far too young. It can't be him. But of course it can be him, because when he went on his evangelical tours of the Mediterranean in AD 52, he was a man. He had had his bar mitzvah. You have your bar mitzvah at 14 and he was 15 years old. So he was a man. Okay, he was a very young man. Guided by Barnabas, but he was a man and he could go about his business. And so the dates do match. But what it means is the crucifixion did not happen in AD 30. It actually happened in AD 70. And again, Arthurian legend confirms this, because Arthurian legend is all to do with this story. Remember, the central character in Arthurian legend is Joseph of Arimathea. So it's all to do with this story. And in Arthurian legend, it says that Joseph of Arimathea took Jesus down from the cross, but then he was imprisoned by the Romans. And he goes to sleep for 3 days and wakes up 40 years later.
3 days again?
3 days again. It's got to be 3 days. And he's not aged at all. So he's exactly the same age. And now he can become an army commander working for Emperor Vespasian, which is exactly what Josephus Flavius was. He was an army commander working for Emperor Vespasian. And so they have to jump this 40-year gap between the classical sort of gospel story and the actual history, which has a 40-year gap on it between AD 30 and AD 70. This is what I call the chronological chasm, and it pervades all of the history that is to do with the gospel story.
It's very interesting, Ralph, as well. I'm going to ask you a question, because from my kind of sort of looking, I mean, I'm by no means an expert on this. This is just something that I've noticed. But there does seem to be a few things going on with the story. So if we take one part of the story being historical, we have another part of the biblical stories that match up seemingly to astrological happenings. And bearing in mind that many, many ancient religions that predate Christianity were all about the happenings in the heavens, because obviously it was extremely important to grow food, etc., etc. It directly affected them. So this was of extreme importance. So you can see remnants of this in the biblical story, obviously the Jesus figure being the central son figure. But also in the biblical story, you also see some mystery, shall we say, from the mystery schools, the initiations and things. You see part of this happening in the Bible as well. You see some elements of Freemasonry in the Bible as well. So what do you think is the reason for this? So if we take the fact that because of your discoveries, we can see actual history coming alive, but what's your reasoning for the astro-theological implications and the mystery initiation part of it as well?
Because this is real history. And the original tenets of the Nazarene Church were Sabaean, the study of the cosmos and the and astrology, study of the stars. That was the original religion of all of these early religions. They were astronomer priests. They studied the stars, and you could use that for many reasons. You could use that to date eras. You can use it for fortune telling, for prophecy, and all of these sort of things, as well as agriculture, as you say. It was very important, and also it was a power symbol as well, because you could tell the king, look, there's going to be an eclipse next week, and there is. That's real power. If you can tell the king what the heavens are going to do in the heavens above, that's real power. And so, that's what they were doing. And yes, of course, there would be elements of mystery schools, because Jesus was a Freemason. Remember, he was not a carpenter. Again, it's very easy to hold these secrets in plain sight and just say, oh, he was a carpenter. But that's not what the text says. The text says he was a tekton. And a tekton in the Greek, an aphero tekton, I think it is a Freemason. So a tekton is a mason. You can hear the word in the word architect. We still use the same word today in English. So he was a mason. He was a Freemason. And if you look at the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of John, that is a third-degree raising. Masonic third-degree raising. It's exactly the same as the process I went through when I became a Master Mason. It's exactly the same.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I saw somewhere that Ma meant nature and son, so it was son of nature. I don't know if you touched upon that. So Mason, son of nature.
Ma, as in Mason.
M-A-S-O-N, Ma. A Ma son. It was a son of nature. I mean, I have come across
Ma in Syriac means a priest, but I don't think Mason comes from that. That's why you get things like Mary. Marie is a female, a priestess.
It's my middle name, funny enough, as well.
Marie.
Yes. It comes from the Greek, and the Greek is tekton, not Mason, of course.
You do have a great mind, Ralph, that's for sure. You know, fascinating conversation.
It is fascinating. So we've only got about 3 minutes left, unfortunately, because
is there enough for another show?
I wish we could go on. So how would you like to sum up then, Ralph?
Oh, there's lots more to come. We haven't even touched on Arthurian
legend. Part 3, definitely.
In the last 3 minutes, well, where can you find this information? Well, my website is edfubooks.com, which is edfu-books. My Facebook site is quite active. Facebook Ralph.Ellis.144. So if you do a Google search for that, it'll come up with my Facebook. I've got a YouTube channel, which is just Ralph Ellis, I think, channel YouTube. And you just search for a thumbnail that's got a phoenix on it, a red and gold phoenix. That's my lecture series. And Amazon, I suppose, is best for the books. And try and get the post 2017 versions, because they will be the latest editions.
Yeah, the most updates.
And so, read the information, see if you agree. I mean, I can't say that this is the absolute truth, but what I can tell you, it does make more sense of the gospel story than the classical interpretation.
Gosh, it's amazing.
What I've actually proved, a bit like with the Old Testament work, what I've proven to myself, at least, is that 90% of the gospel story is correct. So we have this strange situation again, where if you're a classical Christian, you've got to just believe it on faith, because you cannot find this information in the historical record. I found the information in the historical record, and it's 90% correct. The only difference is, as we've explained, the Jesus character is rather more important. He was a real king, and he was involved in a real revolt against Rome. But that's what the Gospels say. The Gospels say that Jesus was jailed alongside revolutionaries who had committed murder in the revolution. Okay, what revolution was that? Yeah, it was the Jewish revolt. So it all does make sense. It's just slightly different to
from
the
how we
classical
understand
interpretation.
it. Exactly. And there we must leave it, sadly. Thank you
well,
so
thank you very much, Ralph,
for coming on the show. And we'll have to
My
do
pleasure.
a part 3.
Part 3 coming up.
Thank you. So thank you for joining us on the Allens Investigate. You can check us out on www.theallensinvestigate.com. You're broadcasting live on the United Public Radio Network 105.3 and 107 FM from New Orleans and on Roku. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye. See you.